Hello and welcome to Elena Meets the Author. This podcast explores how authors create a world that we can escape into. Join me as we demystify the magic that keeps us turning the page. Today, I'm speaking with Lauren Willig, the New York Times bestselling author of more than 25 works of historical fiction. Her latest being The Girl from Greenwich Street, a fascinating drama-filled story about America's first recorded murder trial, a courtroom drama like no other. On December 22nd in 1799, Elma Sands, a young woman of illegitimate birth, put on her best calico dress and left her cousin Katie's boarding house on Greenwich Street in New York City. Elma was planning to elope with her wealthy, supposed fiancé. 12 days later, Elma's body was found in a well, and her supposed fiancé, Levi Weeks, was put on trial. There was no social media, no TV, no telephone, but there was mob culture, and Levi Weeks was effectively canceled before the trial had begun. A trial for which famously flamboyant adversaries, Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, would be co-defending the accused as they battled each other in the 1800 New York elections. Lauren, after that lengthy intro, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me and for summarizing The Girl from Greenwich Street so gorgeously.
It was my pleasure. I really loved it. Really, really. I couldn't put it down. You did the suspense was really well paced. I was like, getting frustrated. Like, what's going on in the next chapter?
Well, I wish I could take credit for it, but this is one of those rare cases an author happens on once in a lifetime where everything is there in the actual historical record.
Yeah, I definitely wanted to talk about that because that is very unusual, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. I know it's very rare that real life arranges itself like fiction, but when it does, you just jump on it.
Exactly. Well, my first question is that you dedicated your book to Harvard Law School and Cravath, Swaine, and Moore. Can you explain your quote-unquote long, strange road back to the courtroom?
Well, yes. So not many people know this about me, but I am, in fact, a lapsed litigator. And I do it's funny, for a while, I used to get trotted out to bar associations to give what I used to call my how not to be a lawyer talks. But I've always felt a bit of a fraud because people will ask me how I went from the law to writing, when in fact, the two always coexisted in my life. So I actually have always wanted to be a novelist. And I had a grand scheme. I was going to go to Harvard grad school, to the history department to get a PhD to write absolutely accurate historical fiction. And so I toddled off to Harvard after Yale. And while I was there, though, I realized that actually academic history is not always the best way to write absolutely accurate historical fiction. Your characters start speaking in footnotes. And also I made the very disillusioning discovery that once you're actually a historian, you realize that there is no such thing as absolutely accurate history. There are debates, there are gaps, there's guesswork. And I found that very disappointing. I also hated grading students. So I lobbed in application down the block to the law school. And I was going to finish my PhD and JD at the same time. But by a strange quirk of fate, I wound up getting a 2-book deal in my first year at Harvard Law. So my law career and my writing career unfolded at the same time. So when I started as a litigator at Cravath, I began at Cravath the same week my third book came out. So I was juggling the two for a while. Anyway, so I stopped practicing in 2008 because I did not have enough vacation time to go on the book tours my publisher wanted me to go on. And that's my long strange road back to the courtroom. I've been writing, this is my 25th work of historical fiction. And it's really the only one that I feel explicitly harkens back to my old career as a litigator.
Interesting. And it's very different now. I remember hearing you saying in an interview that you would never get all this information and transcript because people in the courtroom are told not to say very much, just answer the question really simply.
That's exactly it. Yeah. Whereas this case is amazing, not only because it's our first fully recorded murder trial. The clerk of the court in the case had learned this cool new thing called shorthand. And so he took down the testimony verbatim. But as you were saying, It's a sort of verbatim testimony we don't get now, where people are just pouring out, all their thoughts and feelings and prejudices and experience and all sorts of crazy things come out on the stand that, any good lawyer worth their salt. I mean, yes, you still have people doing that now, but I think it's rarer. Lawyers prep their clients more carefully. There's a lot more routine work that goes into trials now. And I will say, having been a litigator, I put out an SOS to a bunch of academics and lawyers I knew, asking for people who specialized in 18th century legal history, because so many things about this trial confused me because we do things so differently now. I kept saying, what am I missing? What am I getting wrong? And so I spoke to some experts in 18th century legal history and 18th century crime and justice. And they're like, no, you're not missing anything. This is how it worked.
And how did you first decide you wanted to write about this? How did this all start?
Well, through a very highbrow way, through an Instagram post. So I subscribe to a whole bunch of New York history sites. I'm a native New Yorker. I've always been fascinated by the history of my city. And I've also written a couple of Gilded Age books, including one with my good friends, Beatrice Williams and Karen White. And so I have to confess, a lot of these New York history sites, I was there primarily for the gorgeous Gilded Age mansions. But one day about, 6, 7 years ago, a post popped up about the Manhattan Well murder and the Levi Weeks trial. And I thought, oh my goodness, how crazy and wonderful. Burr and Hamilton as co-counsel for the defense just 4 years before the fatal duel. I have to know more. And that led me to the transcript. And then once I read that transcript, I was hooked because the trial really is Law and Order 1800.
I love it. Wow. And then it also features in the musical Hamilton.
So I
doesn't
heard, yes. I have avoided seeing Hamilton. Actually, now that the book's out in the world, I can finally see it. But because I already knew this book was sort of in my queue of things I wanted to write, I didn't want to let Lin-Manuel Miranda's portrayal of Hamilton affect my own. But it's very hard keeping that sort of barrier up. When we were in lockdown for COVID, my 6-year-old was obsessed with the Disney movie version of Hamilton. And so she would sing the songs at me. So I have a vague idea of but I tried to stay away from it as much as possible, even when she was dressing up like Eliza Schuyler.
I love it. Very funny. Can you tell us about some of the more startling surprises you came across in your research?
Oh, my goodness. So many startling surprises. Well, one of the things I learned, and one of these sort of fundamental differences between our system and theirs, was that, of course, I knew there were no police as we know them. There are constables and night watchmen, but their job is purely keeping the peace. But when it comes to the detective function of the police that we come to expect nowadays, think about a Law and Order episode. You've got the detectives who are going and knocking on doors and asking questions, and then they bring their great big file of information to the lawyers who figure out how to present this in court. There are no detectives. So the investigation on the case is being done by the prosecutors and the defense lawyers. So as insane as this sounds, you do really have Aaron Burr, Alexander Hamilton, and Brockholst Livingston running around New York like Jessica Fletcher in Cabot Cove, trying to figure out what happened, interviewing people and winkling out clues. Which, to us just sounds crazy, but it was also, you have to bear in mind, it was a smaller world. There were fewer people to talk to. Yeah. And this case, it's also another crazy thing about it is so Cadwallader Colden, the prosecutor, he's a decade younger than his distinguished opposing counsel. He knows he's outmatched. And so he deals with it by trying to create an absolutely exhaustive case for the prosecution. And he swears in something like 75 witnesses, which is something that, he's basically running around signing up half of New York to testify. I exaggerate slightly. The population of New York at the time was 60,000. So he has to get everyone, but no one in the city had ever seen a trial like this before. And it lasts for 2 days, which at the time was, trials, they went quickly, they wrapped up quickly. To have a trial that lasted over a day was something they were not prepared to deal with. So that was another cool thing.
Until the wee hours, too. But everyone was exhausted.
Well, what happened was now, of course, we sequester juries as a matter of course. We have this built into the system, but they knew there's a common law principle that a jury once sworn cannot be disbanded until they have rendered a verdict. And they get to 2 a.m. the first night. They're not even through the prosecution's witnesses yet. Forget moving on to the defense. And the judge is like, we can power through. And the jury were like, we're falling asleep in the stand. We want to go home. But they can't go home. They know they can't go home, but they don't know what to do with them. And they finally, the trial was being held in Federal Hall, which is the same building where Washington was inaugurated. And they put the jurors to bed on the floor of the picture room. They got them some blankets and some snacks. And I really do believe this trial would have run into a third day, but for the fact that when they reached the wee hours on the second day, no one wants to stay longer except the prosecutor, who's like, please give me more time. But they wind it up really quickly. They sort of power through because no one wants to spend another night sleeping on the floor of the picture room.
You really get the feel, too, in your book, what a fledgling country it is.
Yes, they're figuring out so many things as they go along. I think that's something we don't really think about much, is what the break of England from England meant for so many of our institutions, because we inherited our legal system, our laws, our courts from our colonial governance. And then the revolution happens and they have to figure out, well, what do we keep? What do we reject? How does this all work now that we're a new country?
Yeah, because Burr uses that in one of his defenses.
Yes,
we're not going to do
about hearsay. And, it's like, okay, so what hearsay laws apply? Do laws from England apply or do they not? What do we have to work with here?
Exactly. No, it was great. What I love is when I'm reading historical fiction and I'm learning things without thinking I'm learning them, without it being like a history lesson.
Oh, that's what I always love too. Feeling like you're living there, you're living in another era.
Yes, it was very immersive. In addition to this being a plot-rich story, you really give readers a clear sense of what life was like in New York in the 1800s, the culture, the living conditions, the treatment of women, and as we discussed, the burgeoning legal system. Can you talk a bit about what life was like in New York City back in 1800?
In some ways, it's a classic New York story because the city was growing so rapidly. This is a city of strivers, of immigrants, of people who are coming here for opportunity. New York in 1789 had 30,000 people. 10 years later, when Elma's murdered in 1799, the city has 60,000 people. So Elma is living at a boarding house with her cousin, Katie, who's running the boarding house, and Katie's husband, Elias, and which is in itself emblematic of life in New York at the time because the city is filled with these boarding houses because there's not enough housing for all the people who are coming to the city in search of opportunity. Levi Weeks, the man accused of murdering Elma, is a carpenter. His older brother is a contractor. And the reason Levi has this insane legal dream team defending him is because to be a contractor in 1800 New York is to be a person in high demand. So Ezra Weeks, Levi's older brother, this contractor, can call on Aaron Burr and say, hi, I need you. You, major politician and lawyer, I need you to defend my brother who's been accused of murder. So that's, all linked into the city and its growth and whatnot. But on top of that, I was really grateful that baked into the trial record are all sorts of details of what life was like for a New Yorker in 1800. So we have, Catherine Ring on the stand talking about, when she prepares tea in the afternoon and calling the family down for tea. Or, Levi going to work on a Sunday morning and getting his knee gashed and then, coming back again. So all these little details, or frankly, and this is one that really resonated for me as a mother with young children, where Catherine talks about handing the baby to her husband to fix. And fix was their term for changing the diaper. And basically she's taking the baby and saying, here, you deal with her. You change these soiled cloths. And I think that's something because she had to go do something. She had to go make the tea. She had to go make the porridge. And that's something any mother now can still deal with, the handing the baby off, to her husband. And so I was fascinated by all the little details of life in New York at the time. Also, you got a sense of how much in an era before TV, before all these other amusements, people go to sermons. There's a lot of going to charity sermons. That's your big entertainment. There's theater. And people visit constantly. You've got people in a much smaller city going from house to house, paying calls for a half hour here, a half hour there. And we know about this because a lot of this is part of Levi's alibi. Who was calling on who, when, who was where, when, and so on.
Right. I love it. Yeah. How did they keep themselves busy before the internet?
Well, of course, they had a lot of newspapers, which we also know about from this case, because and there are tons of newspapers, and they all jump on the Levi is a murderer bandwagon because this is an amazing story. It's like a novel. This young rogue seduces a young woman, a virtuous young woman under promise of marriage, and then murders her and dumps her in a well to avoid following through. This is, we would call it clickbait at the time.
Right.
I guess buying newspaper bait.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you if you could read a couple pages from your prologue.
Sure, I'd be
to
delighted.
Give listeners a flavor.
Okay. Prologue. The deceased was a young girl who, till her fatal acquaintance with the prisoner, was virtuous and modest. William Coleman, Report of the Trial of Levi Weeks. New York City, December 22nd, 1799. The shadows were gathering in the back of the house in Greenwich Street. It had been one of those clear, bright winter days when the sun shone pitiless as the last judgment, all light without warmth. But the early winter dusk was finally falling. Elma welcomed it, even if it did make it hard to see her reflection in the scrap of mirror Katie had allowed was permissible to make Elma neat and tidy. Elma draped a handkerchief across her bodice, studying the effect of the fichu. Whatever she did, her calico gown and dimity petticoat looked decidedly provincial. There was only so much one could do with old patterns, cheap fabrics, and a Quaker cousin with an eye for propriety. Soon she'd have dresses of fine muslin and gauze, embroidered all about with this season's whimsies. She'd have clocked stockings of sheerest silk, and shawls so fine one could draw them through a ring. Oh, and she'd have the rings, too, starting with one tonight. He'd not shown it to her. He wouldn't. Let it be a surprise, he'd said. A surprise for their wedding night. Surely he should be allowed some surprises. She'd surprises of her own, Elma had countered, trying to sound like the lady of the world she'd meant to become, not the poor cousin from Cornwall, New York, everyone's drudge and morality tale. She'd taken his hand in hers and kissed each finger, one by one, her eyes on his all the while. He'd liked it well enough, she could tell, because his breath had quickened, and he'd nodded and said a quick "tonight" before a step on the stair behind them had signaled, "Elma?" The kerchief slipped from Elma's grasp at the sound of Katie's voice, so rudely intruding into her own private place. Elma took her time retrieving the handkerchief. "Did you want me?" "No, that is..." Katie hovered at the threshold, neither in nor out. Katie was never still, always up and down stairs, in and out, seeing what needed doing, seeing who wasn't doing what they were meant to be doing, watching, always watching, pretending concern. "Oh, Elma, thee will take a chill. Let me give thee a handkerchief," stuffing thick fabric into the neckline of her dress, muffling her in shawls. She'd like to muffle Elma out of existence, Elma had no doubt, of family embarrassment. Somewhere far to the south in Charleston, Elma's father lived with his other family. Elma used to dream he would come and sweep her away, dress her in silks and laces, put her at his right hand. My daughter, he'd call her. For all she knew, he had other daughters. He'd had another family already. That's what Elma's Uncle David said. A sinner, leading Elma's mother like a brand to the burning. 23 years Elma's mother had been burning, acknowledging her sin, but never any closer to salvation. Elma's mother had been 16 when she'd fallen from grace with a soldier in the Continental Army, 6 years younger than Elma was now. Elma was older, and she knew better. If Elma were to burn, she'd made up her mind to do it in grand style.
Thank you. Was it hard, since Elma is deceased in this story, to find out about Elma, who she was.
That was surprisingly the hardest bit of this book, was finding out about Elma. And when I say surprisingly, it's because there have been there's been so much written about this case. I think largely because of the allure of Burr and Hamilton in the courtroom together. There have been 2 nonfiction books about this. There have been a slew of articles, but I had assumed that even with the rush to get to Burr and Hamilton and courtroom drama, that some of the authors who had written about this would have taken the time to really get the facts of Elma's life right. And what I found was that most of them are really very sloppy, that there's all sorts of misinformation repeated about Elma. People don't get her family relationships right. And actually, within days of Elma being found in the Manhattan well on January 2nd, 1800, articles start being printed talking about how she lived with her aunt and uncle, how she's a Quaker, and so on. And all of this is wrong. She lives with her first cousin. She's not a Quaker. Her cousins are Quakers, but Elma has staunchly refused to join the meeting. But the funny thing is, a lot of the misinformation you find in these documents gets repeated without people trying to verify it. And so what I wound up having to do was go to very basic sources like censuses, wills, Quaker meeting house records to try to figure out simple things like who Elma's mother was, and so on. And, I went down a rabbit hole trying to figure out who Elma's father was and failed. That's a whole other story.
And do we know more about Levi Weeks, the accused?
We know somewhat more about Levi Weeks. I will say one of the trial transcript is amazing because because it was taken down so verbatim and because the lawyers so rarely intervened in the testimony, you get a really strong sense of the various characters involved and their voices. But the 2 major gaps in that are Elma, because she's dead, and Levi, because defendants did not testify in their own case. Fortunately, we do have letters from Levi written later on, after, spoiler, but he winds up in exile for most of his life, roaming from place to place. He eventually fishes up in Nashville. And so we have letters from him to his older brother Ezra in those years of exile, so we can hear his voice then. But of course, this is an older, embittered Levi, so you have to adjust for that. But we do know we know somewhat more about Levi than we do about Elma. By all accounts, he was a handsome, charming young man on the make. Here he is. His older brother has this incredible, thriving business. Levi himself wants to be an architect eventually. He's learning the business from the bottom up. The brothers came from Massachusetts originally, and they've come to New York, this land of opportunity, to make their fortunes. And everything is golden and rosy for Levi until he's accused of Elma Sand's murder. And then his life goes utterly haywire.
And why did these enemies, Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton, decide to take on this case?
Well, that's a tricky one. So there are actually 3 lawyers for the defense. The one who always gets omitted, because he's just less well known now, is Brockholst Livingston, who honestly, he's the only one with any criminal defense experience. If I were on trial for murder in 1800, I would want Brockholst, because he had earlier that year gotten off a murderer who was found literally holding the bloody knife in front of the body and confessed to doing it. That's Brockholst for you. Yeah. He is a brilliant and vicious criminal defense lawyer. So he's really, but Burr and Hamilton, they are a strange pair for this defense because they don't do criminal law. This is not their thing. I think Aaron Burr comes into it because Ezra Weeks had a business relationship with him and so was able to call him. And from Burr's point of view, he was probably in debt to Weeks because he was in debt to everyone at the time, but also Burr, his fledgling Republican Party, they are the party of the common man. That's part of their whole thing. And we've got the 1800 elections coming up. And so for Burr to be in the courtroom in what is clearly, building up to be the media sensation of the new century, defending a carpenter, this is incredibly on brand for Burr for these elections at this moment. Hamilton is stranger. Again, Hamilton, no criminal defense experience. But the story that's always told, usually without question, is that he takes the case because Ezra Weeks is called in a debt. Because Ezra Weeks is the contractor on Hamilton's country house, the Grange. and Hamilton owes him money. The slight problem with this story is Hamilton doesn't buy the land on which the Grange is situated until 4 months after the trial. So this story actually doesn't work. Hamilton doesn't owe him any money for a house that he hasn't hired the architect. It hasn't been designed. It hasn't been built. He doesn't own the land. And so I found one legal scholar in the 1950s who flagged this. And his theory, which I think makes sense, is that Hamilton had promised his poor, long-suffering Eliza he was going to build her a country house. Good contractors are hard to find in New York at the time. If he volunteers to do this, if he manages to get Levi Weeks off for murder, Ezra Weeks is going to have to take on his house. And on top of that, the 1800 New York elections are coming up, and he is not letting Burr have all the publicity. He needs to be in there defending a carpenter and, getting the Federalist side out there. And so I think what really happens is, rather than the traditional story that's repeated where Hamilton reluctantly takes this case because he's in debt to Weeks, I think Hamilton enthusiastically inserts himself into this case for his own ends.
And tell us how the Manhattan well figures into their animosity towards one another, the well where she was found, where Elma was found.
Yes, this is one of these little crazy historical details. Most people here, I admit, will have heard of the Manhattan Company without realizing that they have heard of it, because the Manhattan Company still exists today. Nowadays, it's Chase Bank. So the story...
It used to be Chase Manhattan.
Exactly. Before that was Manufacturers Hanover and so on. You can trace it all the way back to this Manhattan Company. So the story of the Manhattan Company, and this is classic Hamilton and Burr, and I think it reveals their relationship and their characters so well, was a little bit before Elma Sand's murder. Burr comes to Hamilton with an idea to bring clean water to New York City because there have been yellow fever epidemics. And at the time, they think maybe it is dirty water that is responsible for these horrible yellow fever epidemics that are decimating the city. And so at the urging of his brother-in-law, Dr. Thomas Brown, Burr comes up with this scheme. They're going to bring in fresh water from upstate to the city and get rid of the scourge of yellow fever. And Hamilton thinks this is brilliant. And in classic Hamilton fashion, he totally takes over for Burr. He drafts the legislation. He badgers his Federalist friends to pass it. But Burr, he even puts his brother-in-law on the board of directors. But Burr has a trick up his sleeve. And right before the bill goes up for vote, Burr inserts a little clause enabling this water company, the Manhattan Company, to use excess funds to raise credit and lend out. So basically what he is creating, it's not a water company, it's a bank. It's a bank deliberately designed to rival Hamilton's Bank of New York and to serve as a piggy bank for the Republican Party and for Burr, who is Baroque. And by the time but this world was so small, the person who flags this is Judge Lansing, who is later the judge on the Levi Weeks trial, who sees this, refuses to vote for it. But by then, Hamilton has done his work too well. The legislature is all set to pass this, and they do. And Hamilton is apoplectic because Burr has really pulled a fast one on him. And of course, because this was never about the water, it was always about the bank, Burr immediately cheaps out on the water plan. So gone are the plans about using special patent water wheels to bring in water from upstate. And instead, he's like, we can just use this existing pond, the collect, which is, filthy, befouled, whatever. And they're going to lay pipes and dig a few new wells from the, to connect to the collect. And because he's cheaping out, they don't even use metal pipes. He gets Ezra Weeks is the contractor on this. And he does bored logs to these new wells, one of which is the Manhattan well in which Elma is drowned.
I read or listened in one interview where an alternate title could have been The Convenient Corpse.
Yes, that's very true. I mean, and convenient in many ways,
Poor
one
Elma.
of which is, I think, for current historians and legal scholars who have had so much fun with Burr and Hamilton in this case, because all of their idiosyncrasies are on display. And I think in many ways, Elma is often just used as a pretense for getting these guys into the courtroom and watching them elbow each other.
The dialogue is great, and them interrupting each other in their defense, trying to...
When you read this transcript, one of my few complaints about the transcript is that William Coleman, the clerk of the court, he generally does not name which defense attorney is speaking. He just says defense. But you can really, when you read the transcript, you can see where they are interrupting and undermining each other because they have alternate theories of the case, and each one wants to show up better in front of the public.
It's really funny. So women feature as pretty powerless. They're likely to die from childbirth or abuse. Their reputations could easily be ruined, while the reverse is hardly the case. Did this surprise you at all in your research, how prevalent it was? What a hard time women had?
One of the things that struck me very heavily while I was writing this book, was the upstairs, downstairs component of it. And that you have on the upstairs, you have these wealthy, powerful, politically and socially connected men. Hamilton, Burr, Livingston, Walter, Colden. And as you were saying, for them, the consequences of anything are really negligible. They can enhance their reputations with this case, but there's no downside for them. Whereas the women involved in this case, Elma Sands, of course, is dead, but she leaves behind her cousin, Catherine Ring, the proprietor of the boarding house, and her other cousin, Hope Sands, who's her age and was her companion, and their lives are completely torn to shreds by this book. And some of that is a class issue. I mean, these are working women as opposed to aristocratic lawyers. But, as you were speaking, I was thinking, but it's true that the perils of life for women and much of the helplessness extends to upper class women as well. Ezra Weeks' wife, they take her deposition very early on in this case. They take it in mid-January because she is having a rough pregnancy and they know there are good odds she's not going to live till the trial. And you see this pattern repeated over and over again with women being worn out with childbirth. On the other hand, the counterbalance to that is you do also have women who are, very active in the world. Catherine Ring is running a boarding house. She's running a millinery. Part of the friction in her own life is that her husband is a failed entrepreneur, and it's Catherine with her 4 young children who's really supporting the family by running the actual successful businesses that keep them going. And so you've really, that's the push-pull. But at the same time, even with a Catherine, who is a successful businesswoman in her own right, she's doing it under the aegis of her husband, and she is subject to him in so many ways. Yeah.
And the idea of divorce doesn't even enter.
Yeah. Well, funnily enough, this was a rabbit hole I fell down. Was actually, if you were a Quaker, it was easier to get divorced than if you were other denominations. And actually, Quaker women tended to have more autonomy than many other women. But I think Catherine's personality being what it was, divorce was not an option.
Interesting. And what was the Quaker curse?
Oh, my goodness. So this is a fun story. So Catherine Ring, well, it's funny. Actually, one of Hamilton's biographers was convinced that Catherine Ring had killed her cousin Elma for various reasons. But leaving that aside, I think Catherine Ring very deeply and sincerely believed that Levi Weeks had killed her cousin. And she was furious at these fast-talking lawyers who had denied her cousin justice. And I think also, because Elma's members of Catherine's family, once Levi has been acquitted, suspicion falls on various other members of Elma's family. And so Catherine's been smeared, her husband's been smeared, and so on. And so, of course, she is furious at Hamilton and Burr and Brockhurst and Judge Lansing and so on. And as they leave the courtroom, she curses them. And this is the Quaker's curse. And the story is, so people argue that, Hamilton's death in the duel with Burr, Burr's subsequent disgrace, all of that, this goes back to the Quaker curse. Of course, it ignores the fact that Brockhurst Livingston, who, is just as important in getting Levi off as the other two, he leads a long and happy life as a Supreme Court justice, and nothing happens to him. I'd say the best argument for the Quaker curse is Judge Lansing, who we haven't really talked about. He's the judge on the case. And Judge Lansing at 3 a.m. on the second day really wants to get this trial over with. And basically he instructs the jury to acquit Levi. Catherine Ring is furious with Judge Lansing. It's a very, that he basically leaves the jury with no other choice for their verdict. Judge Lansing is another weird New York story. He disappears, and no one to this day knows what happened to him. He goes to meet a friend for tea in the New York hotel and never comes back. And there are all sorts of theories about what happened to him, that he was murdered, that he was disoriented and fell in the river. But that is another great unsolved New York mystery. And that's The Quaker's Curse for you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that was. And then Catherine goes on to have how many more children?
Oh my gosh, she winds up with nine children. So I mean, her marriage to Elias is such a shambles, but it's the classic, let's save the marriage with more kids. But she winds up actually very happy in the end. After Elias descends into alcoholism and is kicked out of the Quaker meeting and eventually dies. I'm trying to remember. I think he dies of yellow fever, but his constitution had been weakened by chronic alcoholism. Once Catherine is finally free of him, she takes her numerous offspring and they move back to Cornwall, New York, where she opens a boarding house and becomes a beloved community figure.
Love it. God, it was such a good book. Yeah, it's such colorful characters. And of course, there's that other lodger.
Oh, yes.
Who's also very interesting. So what do you hope readers take away from this book?
Well, I want them to think about Elma as a person, because what frustrated me researching this book was how often she was flattened into an archetype, that she's either a Madonna, the virtuous woman betrayed by the evil rake, or she's a whore. I mean, the defense tries to paint her as a melancholy, laudanum-addicted nymphomaniac, and which gets repeated by nonfiction writers today as if it's true, which it's a defense strategy. There's actually no proof of any of this. So what I want readers to take away is a sense that here was a real person, a rounded human being who made choices that led her to this moment on the night of December 22nd, 1799, where she leaves and doesn't return. But they're choices you can understand. And that's why I want them to take away a sense of sort of the tragedies that unfold from real human events.
Yeah, exactly. She didn't have that many opportunities. And so she was grabbing an opportunity, as one could understand.
Right. But I wanted to bring the victim back to life, as opposed to having her be just a pretense. Right.
No, it's good. So I read you're working on something now that is not historical fiction. Is this the first time for you?
I've ducked in and out of genres over the years. My first 12 books all had a modern chick lit frame story about a disgruntled Harvard graduate student in London working on her dissertation. So I've dabbled in contemporary before. I mean, the funny thing was I so enjoyed working on this book that I was going to write another book about an 18th century American trial, the trial of the case of Nancy Randolph. It's a case about she's accused of incest and infanticide, and the defense team is Patrick Henry and John Marshall. So two more legal luminaries. I was working on this book. I was researching this book. I made a throwaway comment to my agent about an idea I'd had about a paranormal contemporary romance set at Greenwich Cemetery in Brooklyn, thinking that she'd be like, oh, fun, and move on. And I would continue working on the book I was actually under contract to write, this other 18th century trial. And she was like, oh my God, drop everything, write that. And I said, wait, but I'm under contract. And she said, don't worry, I'll call your editor. And my editor also said, yeah, write that one instead. We'll just have that one be the book for the contract. And so my next book comes out in 2026. It's called What Happens at Nightfall. And it is a paranormal contemporary romance set at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, involving a young woman who does not realize she has ancestral powers, a hot gardener, an angry Renaissance demon who's been freed from a crypt, and a snarky Gilded Age ghost.
Wow. And what time period?
Contemporary. So this takes place basically now.
But goes back in time a bit with the ghost and...
So it's all contemporary, but there is a Gilded Age backstory. Because at some point in the Gilded Age, someone summoned this cranky Renaissance demon for their own, for their own ends, and wound up having to try to contain the demon in a monument in Greenwood Cemetery. And now the demon has escaped and has to be dealt with before it can destroy the city.
Oh, sounds fantastic and very different.
Much fun.
Okay. Well, that's it for today. Thank you so much, Lauren. I really enjoyed talking to you and learning more about the book and what went into it. And as you say, all the little details that you discovered in your research that helped the story along. It was great.
Thank you so much for having me and letting me babble history at you.
Well, I love it. Well, that's it for Hamilton Burr and America's first recorded murder trial, Law and Order 1800. I'm not going to spill the beans. You'll just have to read The Girl from Greenwich Street to find out what happens. And I'll see you all in 2 weeks when I'm talking about an altogether different novel, a stunning work of fiction that I read several months ago and can't stop thinking about. The Safekeep by Yale Vanderwooden. Stay tuned and see you in a few weeks.